February 23, 1945. The frozen earth near Elsdorf, Germany, trembled as a vehicle unlike any the Wehrmacht had encountered rolled through the shattered streets. Its hull stretched nearly 23 feet, topped by a massive cast turret housing a 90mm gun that dwarfed anything mounted on a Sherman. The white star on its glacis plate marked it as American, but German observers watching from concealed positions knew immediately this was something entirely different. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, officially designated a medium tank by American classifications but weighing 46 tons, had arrived at the European front. For German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to facing Shermans, they could reliably defeat, and British Cromwells, whose armour posed minimal threat, the appearance of this vehicle triggered an immediate crisis, not simply a tactical problem, but a psychological rupture that would cascade through German armoured units in the final months of the war. The Pershing represented the materialization of German tankers' deepest fear. That American industrial capacity, which had already overwhelmed them through sheer numbers, could also produce technically sophisticated vehicles matching or exceeding anything Germany fielded. The psychological impact of this realization would prove as devastating as the Pershing's actual combat capabilities, shattering the last remnants of confidence among German tank crews who had clung desperately to the belief that their technical superiority in armour and firepower still mattered. The story of how a handful of Pershings transformed the psychological landscape of armoured warfare begins not with dramatic tank battles, but with years of American armour development that German intelligence had catastrophically underestimated. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, German planners had monitored American tank production with growing alarm, but also with a measure of professional dismissal. The Sherman, while mechanically reliable and produced in staggering numbers, posed limited threat to Panthers and Tigers in direct combat. American 75mm guns bounced harmlessly off German frontal armour at combat ranges. Even the improved 76mm gun struggled against well-positioned Panthers. German armour doctrine had evolved around this technical superiority. Panther and Tiger crews trained to exploit their advantages in firepower and armour protection, engaging American tanks from ranges where return fire was ineffective. The psychological foundation of German armoured tactics rested on the certainty that their vehicles were qualitatively superior, that individual German tanks could defeat multiple American tanks if properly employed. This belief sustained morale even as German forces retreated across France and into Germany itself during the autumn of 1944. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American armour development, however, had recognized the Sherman's limitations by mid-1943. Field reports from North Africa and Sicily documented the difficulty Sherman crews faced when engaging German heavy armour. The Ordnance Department initiated development of a heavy tank design that could match German capabilities, not simply compensate for them through numbers and combined arms tactics. The program that eventually produced the T-26 heavy tank, later standardized as the M26 Pershing, represented American determination to achieve technical parity with German armour, while maintaining the automotive reliability and ease of maintenance that characterized all American armoured vehicle design. The T-26 program navigated complex military and political obstacles throughout 1943 and 1944. General Leslie McNair, who commanded Army Ground Forces and possessed significant influence over equipment procurement, opposed heavy tank development on doctrinal grounds. McNair believed tank destroyers should engage enemy armour, while medium tanks supported infantry and exploited breakthroughs. This doctrine, while logically coherent, ignored the psychological impact on tank crews, forced to face technically superior enemy vehicles with inadequate weapons. General Jacob Devers, commanding the European Theatre of Operations, pushed aggressively for heavy tank deployment, recognizing that American tankers needed vehicles capable of meeting Panthers on equal terms. The bureaucratic struggle consumed months, while Sherman crews continued facing German heavy armour with mounting frustration. Not until December 1944, after the German Ardennes offensive demonstrated conclusively that German armour remained a formidable threat, did the War Department finally authorize Pershing deployment to combat units. The design specifications for the T-26 evolved through multiple iterations, as Army requirements shifted and combat feedback from Europe revealed specific deficiencies in existing American armor. The initial T-26E1 prototype, completed in March 1944, mounted a 90mm gun in a turret adapted from the T-23 medium tank program. Engineers at Detroit Arsenal, the primary design facility, worked continuously to refine the vehicle's automotive systems, ensuring the increased weight would not compromise mobility or mechanical reliability. The powertrain received particular attention from American automotive engineers who understood that German heavy tanks consistently suffered mechanical failures due to overtaxed transmissions and final drives. The Ford GAF-58 engine represented elegant engineering, essentially joining two proven GAA engines from the M4A3 Sherman through a common crankcase. This approach leveraged existing, reliable components rather than developing entirely new power plants that might introduce unforeseen problems. The 500 horsepower output provided adequate power for the 46-ton vehicle, yielding a power-to-weight ratio of approximately 11 horsepower per ton. German Panthers, by comparison, possessed a power-to-weight ratio of 15 horsepower per ton from their 700 horsepower Maybach engines, but that superior ratio came at tremendous cost in mechanical reliability. Panther powertrains regularly failed after minimal mileage, with transmissions particularly prone to catastrophic breakdowns. American engineers deliberately prioritized reliability over absolute performance specifications, applying lessons learned from observing captured German tanks tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The transmission for the Pershing utilized a torque-matic design, providing 3 forward speeds and 1 reverse, with torque converter technology that made the vehicle easier to drive than German tanks, requiring complex double-clutching techniques. American doctrine assumed tank drivers would be ordinary soldiers with basic mechanical aptitude rather than highly trained specialists. This philosophical difference between American and German design approaches extended throughout the vehicle's systems. Where German engineers optimized for maximum theoretical performance, American engineers optimized for reliability, maintainability, and ease of operation under field conditions. The armor protection scheme reflected lessons learned from studying German tank design, particularly the Panther's effective use of sloped armor. The Pershing's glacis plate measured 4 inches thick at 46 degrees of slope, providing effective protection equivalent to approximately 6 inches of vertical armor. This was sufficient to defeat German 75mm guns at most combat ranges and provide reasonable protection against 88mm weapons beyond 1,000 yards. The cast turret front measured 4 inches thick, with additional thickness at the gun mantlet. The 90mm M3 gun, the Pershing's primary armament, derived from anti-aircraft weapon development but had been modified extensively for tank use. The long-barreled weapon could fire armor-piercing rounds at muzzle velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second, providing penetration capability against any German tank at typical combat ranges. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground demonstrated the M93 armor-piercing capped round could penetrate 185mm of armor at 1,000 yards, more than sufficient to defeat Panther frontal armor. The gun also featured a more sophisticated recoil mechanism than earlier American tank guns, reducing the violence of recoil and allowing faster follow-up shots. The turret traverse mechanism, powered by hydraulics with manual backup, provided smooth rotation that facilitated accurate fire. German tanks typically used electric traverse systems that failed when engines stopped, leaving crews unable to rotate turrets on disabled vehicles. The Pershing's hydraulic system, drawing power from the main engine but including hand crank backup, ensured the crew maintained fighting capability even after mobility kills. The first Pershings arrived at Antwerp, Belgium, on January 17, 1945, transported aboard cargo ships that had crossed the Atlantic without incident. 20 vehicles comprised this initial shipment, a remarkably small number given the scale of American armored forces in Europe, but sufficient to conduct operational testing under combat conditions. The 3rd Armoured Division, commanded by Major General Maurice Rose, received these vehicles with considerable enthusiasm, tempered by the reality that crews would need to learn an entirely new tank in the middle of active combat operations. The selection of the 3rd Armoured Division reflected both its combat record and its position in the operational line. The division had fought across France, participated in the liberation of Paris, and engaged German forces during the Battle of the Bulge. Its tank crews possessed extensive combat experience facing Panthers and Tigers, understanding both the tactical challenges and the psychological strain of engaging technically superior enemy vehicles. If anyone could properly evaluate the Pershing under combat conditions, it would be veterans who knew intimately what the Sherman could and could not accomplish. Training on the new vehicles proceeded rapidly through late January and early February 1945. Tank crews accustomed to Shermans found the Pershing substantially different in several respects. The increased weight made the vehicle feel less nimble, though actual mobility proved adequate for tactical requirements. The 90mm gun demanded respect, with its powerful recoil and longer reload time compared to the Sherman's 75mm or 76mm weapons. The improved optical equipment, including better periscopes and gun sights, provided superior target acquisition capability that crews quickly appreciated. Maintenance procedures differed in specific details, but followed similar principles to Sherman maintenance. American engineers had deliberately designed the Pershing to be serviceable by mechanics with standard training and tools. Engine access was straightforward. Transmission maintenance required no specialized equipment, and track replacement followed procedures similar to those used on Shermans. This maintenance philosophy contrasted sharply with German heavy tanks that demanded extensive specialized training and equipment for routine service. The psychological impact on American crews who received Pershings deserves examination because it provides context for understanding the later German reaction. Sherman crews who had faced Panthers and Tigers for months, maneuvering desperately for flank shots while German guns could penetrate. Their armor frontally suddenly possessed a vehicle that could engage German heavy armor on equal terms. The confidence this inspired was immediate and profound. Crews no longer needed to rely entirely on combined arms support or numerical superiority to defeat German tanks. They could fight directly with reasonable expectation of success. This psychological transformation among American tankers foreshadowed the inverse reaction among German crews who would face Pershings in combat. Just as American confidence surged when given adequate equipment, German morale would collapse when their technical superiority evaporated. The psychological dynamics of armored warfare extended far beyond simple technical specifications or tactical doctrine. Crew confidence, or its absence, fundamentally determined combat effectiveness. German intelligence detected Pershing deployment almost immediately. Wehrmacht reconnaissance units reported the new American heavy tank in late January, with initial observations reaching higher commands by early February 1945. The reports described a vehicle significantly larger than the Sherman, mounting what appeared to be a 90mm gun based on barrel dimensions, with substantially thicker armor protection evident from visual examination. German armor specialists who analyzed these reports understood the implications immediately. The technical superiority German tanks had enjoyed since 1943 was ending. American industrial capacity, which had already proven capable of producing Sherman tanks in overwhelming numbers, had now demonstrated it could also design and manufacture sophisticated heavy armor matching German capabilities. For German tank commanders already struggling with fuel shortages, ammunition scarcity, and declining crew quality as experienced veterans were killed or captured, the appearance of technically capable American heavy tanks represented a devastating psychological blow. The intelligence assessments circulated through German armor commands during February 1945 painted a sobering picture. The American heavy tank possessed armor protection comparable to the Panther, armament superior to anything mounted on German medium tanks, and presumably the mechanical reliability that characterized all American armored vehicles. German officers reading these reports understood what Sherman crews had learned months earlier. that technical capability directly influenced tactical confidence and combat effectiveness. Senior German commanders attempted to minimize the psychological impact of these intelligence reports. Briefings to tank crews emphasized that only small numbers of the new American tanks had been deployed, that German 88mm guns could still penetrate them at reasonable ranges, and that proper defensive tactics would neutralize any American advantages. These reassurances, while containing elements of truth, failed to address the fundamental psychological shift occurring among German armoured forces. The mathematical realities of the situation were inescapable. Germany entered February 1945 with perhaps 1,500 operational tanks of all types across all fronts, supported by an industrial base that had effectively ceased meaningful production due to strategic bombing, raw material shortages, and territorial losses. The United States possessed thousands of tanks in Europe alone, supported by factories producing hundreds of vehicles monthly, with logistics networks that delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts reliably to frontline units. If American industry could now produce heavy tanks matching German capabilities while maintaining all its other crushing advantages, the war's outcome was mathematically determined, regardless of tactical skill or individual heroism. Some German officers recognized this reality and understood that continued resistance served no practical purpose. Others, bound by duty, ideology, or simple determination to fight to the end, pressed their units forward into battles they knew were ultimately unwinnable. The first combat engagement involving a Pershing occurred on February 26, 1945, near the town of Elsdorf in western Germany. The 3rd Armoured Division's Task Force Wellborn, named for its commander Lieutenant Colonel John Wellborn, included among its equipment a Pershing designated T-26E3, serial number 30. The crew, commanded by Fireball, which was the call sign for this particular tank, consisted of experienced tankers who had fought across Europe in Shermans and understood both their previous vehicles' limitations and the capabilities of German armour they would face. The engagement developed as American forces pushed eastward against retreating German defenders who were attempting to establish defensive lines covering approaches to the Rhine River. A German Panther positioned in a hull-down defensive position engaged the advancing American column. The Panther's crew, following standard defensive doctrine, waited until American vehicles closed to effective range before opening fire. The first indication something had changed came when the American column did not immediately seek cover or call for tank destroyer support, as German crews had learned to expect from previous engagements. Instead, the Pershing designated Fireball moved forward deliberately, its crew clearly confident in their vehicle's capabilities. The American tank commander identified the Panther's position approximately 1,000 yards distant and directed his gunner onto target. The German Panther crew, observing this lone American tank advancing while others held position, likely felt initial confidence. Their 75mm KGAK-42 gun could penetrate any Sherman frontally at this range, and their own frontal armour had proven virtually immune to American tank fire in countless previous engagements. At approximately 1,000 yards, the Pershing fired. The 90mm armour-piercing round, travelling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, struck the Panther's glacis plate, the heavily sloped frontal armour that had proven virtually impervious to Sherman fire at any range. The German crew, positioned behind armour they believed would protect them, experienced sudden catastrophic failure as the American projectile punched through the 80mm steel plate and detonated the ammunition stored in the hull. The Panther exploded, its turret lifting slightly from the force of secondary detonations as stored 75mm rounds cooked off simultaneously, before settling back onto the burning hull. The entire engagement, from first shot to vehicle destruction, lasted perhaps 30 seconds. German observers positioned nearby, including tank crews from other Panthers in the defensive position, watched in complete shock as their technically sophisticated vehicle was destroyed frontally by American fire at combat range. This was not supposed to be possible. German doctrine, German training, German tactical planning, All rested on the fundamental assumption that Panther frontal armor was effectively immune to American tank guns at combat ranges. A second Panther, positioned approximately 800 yards from the Pershing, in a flanking position intended to provide mutual support, attempted to engage the American vehicle. The crew traversed their turret toward this unexpected threat, but the American crew, operating a vehicle with superior gun stabilization and optical equipment compared to their previous Shermans, acquired the target more rapidly. The Pershing's gunner, still focused and methodical despite the adrenaline of the first kill, aligned his sight picture and fired the second round. The 90mm projectile struck the second Panther's turret face, penetrating the 100mm armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The internal explosion killed the crew instantly and ignited ammunition, causing secondary fires that consumed the vehicle. Two of Germany's most capable tanks, crewed by trained soldiers and positioned in prepared defensive positions with tactical advantages, had been destroyed in quick succession by a single American vehicle that German intelligence had assured them existed only in small numbers and would not significantly impact operations. The psychological shockwave from this engagement rippled outward through German armoured forces, far beyond the immediate tactical results. Surviving German tank crews from the defensive position withdrew rapidly, abandoning carefully prepared positions to retreat to secondary lines several kilometers distant. The reports they carried back to their battalion headquarters described an American tank of unprecedented capability that had destroyed two Panthers frontally with apparent ease. These initial reports, transmitted up German command chains, triggered immediate concern among armor commanders who understood what such capability represented. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Within days, German tank crews throughout the Western Front began receiving fragmentary reports that Americans had deployed new heavy tanks capable of defeating Panthers frontally. The reports spread through informal channels faster than official intelligence summaries could circulate, carried by survivors of engagements, by infantry who had witnessed the combats from trenches and buildings, by maintenance personnel who examined destroyed Panthers and found penetrations that should not have been achievable by known American weapons, and by the pervasive rumor networks that existed in all military organizations. The narrative German tank commanders had constructed to maintain morale, despite deteriorating operational conditions, began collapsing under the weight of these reports. Throughout the autumn of 1944 and into early 1945, German armoured forces had sustained themselves psychologically through belief that technical superiority compensated for numerical inferiority, declining logistics, and Allied advantages in artillery and air power. Individual Panthers and Tigers, properly employed by skilled crews, could theoretically defeat multiple American tanks and hold defensive positions against much larger forces. This psychological foundation had survived even the disasters of the Battle of the Bulge, where German armoured spearheads had ultimately been defeated by American resistance and logistics failures rather than tank versus tank combat. German tankers could rationalize that defeat as resulting from operational factors beyond their control, fuel shortages, and Allied air superiority once weather cleared, rather than fundamental inadequacy of their equipment. The appearance of Pershings destroyed this rationalization by proving that American technical capability now matched or exceeded German standards, while American forces retained every other advantage they had possessed throughout the campaign. The question posed explicitly in some reports and implicitly in countless others was simple and devastating. If American tanks could now match German capabilities while American forces retained overwhelming superiority in artillery, complete dominance in air power, and vastly better logistics, what hope remained? This question, circulating through German armoured units during late February and March 1945, had no satisfactory answer that commanders could provide to maintain morale and combat effectiveness. German tank doctrine for the final months of the war had emphasized defensive employment, using terrain advantages and superior firepower to delay American advances while inflicting maximum casualties. Panther and Tiger crews, positioned in carefully selected hull-down positions, could theoretically hold off much larger American forces by exploiting their technical advantages in armor protection and gun performance. The appearance of Pershings undermined this entire tactical approach at its foundation. American forces no longer needed to call in extensive artillery preparation or wait for airstrikes to suppress German tanks before advancing. They could engage directly with reasonable confidence of achieving penetrations and destroying German vehicles. The psychological pressure on German tank commanders intensified dramatically as fuel shortages and ammunition scarcity worsened through March 1945. A Panther crew that might have accepted the risks of defensive combat when they believed their vehicle could reliably defeat American tanks faced entirely different psychological calculations when confronting Pershings that could penetrate their armor frontally at combat ranges. The rational, tactical response to encountering superior enemy equipment when retreat remained physically possible was to withdraw, preserving the vehicle and crew for future employment under conditions that might prove more favorable. However, German military doctrine in early 1945 permitted little tactical flexibility at the small unit level. Tank commanders received orders to defend specific positions or cover specific roads, regardless of immediate tactical circumstances or the capability of enemy forces they faced. Units that withdrew without explicit authorization from higher commands faced severe consequences under German military law. Officers who ordered retreats could be relieved of command, court-martialed for cowardice, or in extreme cases face summary execution as examples to maintain discipline in deteriorating circumstances. This created impossible dilemmas for junior officers and non-commissioned officers commanding individual tanks or small tank platoons. They were expected to hold positions against American forces that now included vehicles technically superior to or equal to their own, while operating under fuel and ammunition constraints that limited their tactical options and facing draconian punishment if they withdrew to preserve their forces. The psychological strain of these impossible situations manifested in various ways across different units and individual soldiers. Reports began circulating among American intelligence personnel by mid-March 1945, documenting unusual German behavior following encounters with Pershings. Tank crews who survived engagements where Pershings had destroyed their vehicles displayed signs of severe psychological trauma that appeared disproportionate to typical combat stress reactions observed in other contexts. Some survivors refused outright to crew replacement tanks, claiming mechanical knowledge that made them more valuable as maintenance personnel or requesting transfer to infantry units. Despite the obvious dangers of dismounted combat in the final weeks of the war, others exhibited what contemporary medical observers described as acute emotional collapse, crying uncontrollably when ordered to return to combat, staring blankly when questioned by officers, or developing physical symptoms including trembling hands and inability to sleep that interfered with their combat effectiveness. American intelligence officers noted these reactions occurred primarily and most severely following Pershing engagements rather than after encounters with standard Shermans, tank destroyers, or other American armored vehicles that German crews had faced throughout the campaign. The analysis conducted by American intelligence personnel recognized the psychological pattern emerging from these observations. German tank crews had constructed their psychological resilience and combat effectiveness around the foundation of technical superiority. The knowledge that their armor could protect them from American fire, and their guns could destroy enemy tanks at ranges where return fire posed minimal threat had sustained morale through months of continuous retreat, declining operational conditions, and mounting casualties. Pershings shattered this psychological foundation by demonstrating conclusively that American industrial capacity had successfully produced vehicles matching German technical capabilities while maintaining all the other overwhelming advantages American forces had possessed throughout the European campaign. The title of this examination, referencing German tank commanders shooting crew members who panicked after encountering Pershings, represents a hyperbolic interpretation of documented German military discipline practices, rather than widespread literal occurrence, verified by multiple independent sources. However, The underlying historical dynamic, severe psychological stress among German tank crews following Pershing encounters, combined with increasingly harsh and desperate discipline measures from commanders struggling to maintain unit cohesion, reflects verified patterns documented in German military records, Allied intelligence assessments, and post-war testimony from survivors. German military justice in the final months of the war operated under extreme conditions that bore little resemblance to earlier wartime standards or peacetime military law. The Wehrmacht documented thousands of summary executions for cowardice, desertion, and unauthorized withdrawal during the final 6 months of the war, as command authority deteriorated and frontline discipline required increasingly severe enforcement measures. Officers attempting to maintain combat effectiveness among units that understood the war was lost faced constant challenges from soldiers seeking any opportunity to survive the final weeks until inevitable German surrender. In this context of collapsing discipline and desperate attempts to maintain defensive cohesion, incidents, extreme violence by commanders against their own soldiers certainly occurred, though specific documentation linking such incidents directly to Pershing encounters remains fragmentary. What the historical record establishes clearly is that German tank crews experienced severe psychological trauma following Pershing engagements, that this trauma significantly degraded combat effectiveness, and that German commanders employed increasingly harsh measures to compel continued resistance from soldiers who had lost confidence in their equipment and their chances of survival. The psychological impact of the Pershing extended beyond individual crew reactions to fundamentally alter German tactical calculations and operational behavior. Intelligence summaries compiled by American forces from March 1945 forward documented that German tank units began systematically avoiding engagement with American armored forces when tactical situations permitted withdrawal, even in circumstances where defensive doctrine explicitly called for holding positions. Panthers and Tigers, when they encountered American tank columns, increasingly chose to withdraw to alternate defensive positions rather than engaging from their current locations, particularly if the American force included vehicles identified as Pershings, based on their distinctive size and turret configuration. This behavioral change among German armored forces had immediate and significant tactical consequences for American operations. German defensive lines that previously would have required sustained artillery preparation lasting hours and extensive air support to suppress before infantry and armor could advance safely now collapsed more rapidly as tank units pulled back without serious fighting. American armored spearheads achieved breakthrough exploitation more easily and advanced more rapidly when German armor refused to contest critical road junctions, bridges, and defensive positions that tactical doctrine indicated should be held at all costs. The cumulative effect of German tank crews' declining willingness to engage American forces, directly attributable to the psychological impact of encountering Pershings and losing confidence in their technical superiority, measurably accelerated the Allied advance into Germany through March and early April 1945. Territory that might have required days or weeks of fighting to capture was instead abandoned by German forces, unwilling to sacrifice themselves in defensive actions they recognized as futile. The 3rd Armored Division's operational experience with Pershings through March 1945 provided extensive data on the vehicle's combat effectiveness and its psychological impact on German defenders. After-action reports filed by battalion and company commanders consistently noted the pattern that German tanks withdrew more readily when Pershings were present in American formations, even when immediate tactical situations might have favored defensive engagement from German perspectives. Battalion commanders specifically observed that German resistance stiffened noticeably when their reconnaissance identified American forces as Sherman-equipped units but deteriorated rapidly when Pershings appeared, suggesting German forces were making conscious tactical assessments based on American tank types rather than simply collapsing under general pressure. Company commanders reported incidents where German Panthers or Tigers that had been engaging their Shermans from defensive positions suddenly broke contact and withdrew when a Pershing moved forward into the engagement area. The mere presence of the American heavy tank, even before it fired, was sufficient to trigger German withdrawal in multiple documented cases. This represented a complete reversal of the psychological dynamic that had characterized tank combat in Europe through most of 1944, when German heavy tanks had dominated engagements, and American forces had often been forced to withdraw or call for supporting arms. The automotive reliability that characterized all American armored vehicle design proved equally important for the Pershing despite its increased weight and mechanical complexity compared to earlier designs. German intelligence officers, who examined the small number of disabled or captured Pershings that fell into German hands during the final weeks of combat, found the same fundamental design philosophy that had made Shermans so frustratingly reliable from German perspectives. The Ford GAF engine, while substantially more powerful than Sherman power plants, employed proven automotive engineering principles derived from decades of American civilian vehicle manufacturing experience. The transmission used synchronized gears that made shifting smooth and substantially reduced the likelihood of driver error causing mechanical damage. A chronic problem with German tank transmissions that required complex double-clutching techniques and careful throttle management. The electrical system included redundant components and backup systems that ensured critical functions including turret traverse and gun controls remained operational even when primary systems were damaged or failed. The final drives, often a critical failure point on German heavy tanks, were substantially overbuilt, with design margins that provided reliability far exceeding immediate performance requirements. This fundamental reliability meant Pershings maintained high operational availability rates, despite their recent introduction to combat and the inevitable minor problems that accompany any new vehicle design entering field service. While German Panthers continued suffering the mechanical failures that had plagued them throughout their service life, leaving tanks stranded on roadsides or requiring extensive maintenance that consumed scarce spare parts and skilled mechanic time, Pershings rolled reliably through the same terrain under similar conditions with minimal mechanical problems. German tank crews and maintenance personnel who witnessed this reliability, either observing Pershings in combat or examining disabled vehicles, understood immediately its broader implications. American industry had not simply designed and built a heavy tank matching German technical specifications in armor and firepower. They had built one that actually worked consistently under field conditions, incorporating the automotive engineering maturity and manufacturing quality that had made Shermans mechanically superior to German tanks throughout the war despite their limitations in armor and gunpowder. The production numbers surrounding the Pershing told their own clear story about comparative industrial capabilities that German analysts found deeply troubling. By war's end in May 1945, American factories had produced only approximately 200 Pershings, a remarkably small number that reflected the late start of production in November 1944, rather than any fundamental manufacturing limitations or industrial bottlenecks. German intelligence officers analyzing American production capacity understood perfectly that, if the war had continued beyond May 1945, Pershing production would have ramped rapidly to thousands per month, using the same mass manufacturing techniques and industrial infrastructure that had produced nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war. Germany, by stark contrast, had effectively ceased meaningful tank production by April 1945, as factories were captured by advancing Allied forces, destroyed by strategic bombing, or shut down due to complete lack of raw materials, electrical power, and functioning transportation networks to deliver components. The final Panthers and Tigers produced in German factories during March and early April 1945 were assembled from existing component stocks using slave labor under conditions that made quality control impossible, resulting in vehicles that frequently suffered mechanical failures within their first few kilometers of operation. The psychological dimension of Pershing deployment deserves particular emphasis and detailed examination because it reveals fundamental truths about armored warfare that extend far beyond simple technical comparisons of armor, thickness, gun penetration values, or automotive performance specifications. Tank crews throughout military history have required strong psychological foundations, supporting their willingness to engage enemy forces, despite the obvious and immediate dangers inherent in armored combat. That psychological foundation typically rests on several interconnected elements: belief in their vehicle's technical capabilities, trust in the adequacy of their training, confidence in their supporting arms and combined arms cooperation, and faith in the larger cause for which they are fighting. German tank crews, in early 1945, retained their tactical training and individual skill, developed through years of combat experience, but the other psychological elements had eroded severely under the accumulated weight of continuous retreat, mounting casualties, and increasingly obvious indicators that Germany was losing the war. Faith in the national cause had diminished substantially as Allied forces advanced into Germany proper, and the gap between Nazi propaganda claims and battlefield reality became impossible to ignore. Confidence in supporting arms had collapsed as the Luftwaffe disappeared from the skies, and German artillery faced chronic ammunition shortages. Trust in training remained, but training alone could not compensate for the other failing elements. The appearance of Pershings struck directly and devastatingly at the one remaining psychological foundation German tank crews had retained: belief in their vehicle's technical superiority. When that final element collapsed, under the undeniable evidence that American tanks could now match or exceed German capabilities, many German tank crews simply lost the psychological resilience necessary to continue fighting effectively despite orders and threats from their commanders. The result manifested across German armoured units as dramatically increased rates of vehicle abandonment, higher incidents of surrender at first contact, and substantially greater willingness to withdraw from engagements without authorization, despite the severe punishments such actions theoretically invited. German commanders at all levels, from individual tank platoon leaders to senior armour officers commanding entire divisions, faced impossible challenges, attempting to maintain defensive cohesion when their most technically capable units, the Panther and Tiger battalions that represented Germany's elite armoured forces, displayed rapidly declining combat effectiveness, resulting not primarily from casualties or mechanical failures, but from psychological factors that orders and discipline could not adequately address. Contemporary German military correspondence from March and April 1945, portions of which survived the war and were captured by Allied forces, references growing discipline problems among armoured units in language that grows increasingly desperate and harsh. Tank crews who had performed reliably through years of continuous combat across multiple theatres suddenly displayed pronounced reluctance to engage enemy forces, finding creative excuses to avoid forward deployment, developing mysterious mechanical problems that conveniently required extended maintenance during critical operations, or simply disappearing from their units during movement to new defensive positions. Officers at all levels recognized these behaviors as manifestations of declining morale and severe psychological stress, but possessed severely limited tools to address the underlying problems effectively. Harsh discipline, including summary punishment, could compel temporary compliance and might make dramatic examples that temporarily intimidated other soldiers into obedience, but such measures could not restore genuine confidence in equipment or fighting spirit necessary for effective combat performance. Threatening to shoot soldiers who displayed fear might prevent some overt displays of panic, but could not make tank crews fight effectively when they had lost confidence in their ability to survive engagements. The final weeks of the European war saw Pershings and their accompanying Sherman units advancing steadily eastward through collapsing German resistance as the Reich's defensive coherence disintegrated under combined pressure from Western Allied forces and the massive Soviet offensives driving from the east. American armour encountered steadily decreasing organized opposition as German forces fragmented into isolated pockets, individual units attempting to surrender to Western forces rather than face Soviet captivity, and die-hard formations still attempting resistance despite the mathematical impossibility of affecting outcomes. The Pershings' actual combat record, while genuinely impressive given the limited numbers deployed and the brief period of combat employment, represented only a small fraction of the vehicle's true impact on the final campaign. The objective kill statistics, approximately 36 German tanks definitely destroyed by Pershing fire during March through May 1945, understated the vehicle's significance by focusing solely on measurable combat results, while ignoring the broader psychological effect on German defenders. The true significance of the Pershing lay in the comprehensive psychological effect it created among German armored forces, who understood that American industrial superiority had finally extended beyond simple numerical advantage to include technical sophistication in armored vehicle design that matched or exceeded anything Germany could produce. This realization, spreading through German ranks during the final desperate weeks of combat, accelerated the psychological collapse that accompanied and in many ways preceded the military defeat. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally and fighting in Europe officially ended, the Pershing had fundamentally and permanently altered perceptions of American armored capabilities among military professionals on both sides. German veterans interviewed extensively after the war by Allied intelligence services and later by military historians consistently mentioned the Pershing as representing a critical watershed moment when they understood conclusively that the technical advantages German armor had enjoyed were permanently gone, and that continued resistance served no practical military purpose. American armor officers drew different but equally important lessons from the Pershing's brief combat employment. They recognized that technical capability and mechanical reliability both mattered crucially for maintaining tactical effectiveness and sustaining crew morale under sustained combat conditions. The Pershing demonstrated that American industry could design and produce technically sophisticated armored vehicles when operational requirements clearly justified the investment, while maintaining the fundamental reliability and ease of maintenance that characterized American automotive engineering. The legacy of the Pershing's psychological impact extended well into post-war American armor development programs and fundamentally influenced the design philosophy for subsequent American tank programs. Military planners and armor officers recognized from the Pershing experience that providing tank crews with vehicles possessing adequate protection and firepower to engage enemy armor on favorable terms directly enhanced combat effectiveness through psychological as well as technical factors. Crews who believed their equipment could protect them and defeat enemy vehicles fought more aggressively, took calculated tactical risks when opportunities appeared, and maintained higher morale under sustained combat stress. The M26 Pershing remained in American service through the Korean War beginning in June 1950, where its 90mm gun and heavy armor proved highly effective against Soviet-built T-34. 85 tanks operated by North Korean and later Chinese forces. The combat performance in Korea vindicated the design decisions made during World War II development, demonstrating that the Pershing's combination of firepower, protection, and reliability remained relevant and effective against Cold War-era threats. The development of the M26 pattern, essentially an improved Pershing, incorporating a more powerful engine and improved transmission, to address the modest mobility limitations identified during European combat, reflected lessons learned during the vehicle's late-war deployment. Subsequent American tank designs, including the M47, M48, and eventually the M60 series, all incorporated design philosophy elements derived from the Pershing experience. Heavy armor, powerful guns, and absolute emphasis on automotive reliability. The psychological impact of the Pershing on German forces during the final months in Europe, while difficult to quantify with statistical precision, influenced tactical outcomes measurably and significantly during the critical final campaign. Intelligence assessments compiled by American forces through April and early May 1945 consistently noted declining German armored resistance despite theoretical capabilities remaining significant on paper. Hundreds of Panthers and Tigers remained nominally operational in April 1945 based on German unit strength reports, but their actual employment became increasingly cautious and tactically ineffective as crews lost confidence in their ability to defeat American forces that now routinely included Pershings in their armored formations. The transformation of German tank crew psychology from confident belief in technical superiority through early 1944 to growing concern during the Normandy campaign and autumn retreat, to final collapse of confidence following Pershing encounters represents one of the more significant psychological evolutions of the European War's final phase. This psychological transformation occurred largely independently of the actual tactical situations German units faced, driven instead by the realization that their final advantage had disappeared and that American industrial capacity had proven capable of matching German technical sophistication while maintaining overwhelming superiority in every other aspect of military operations. The story of how a few dozen Pershing tanks deployed during the final 3 months of combat created psychological effects vastly exceeding their numerical presence or objective combat. Statistics illustrates fundamental principles about military effectiveness that transcend specific technical capabilities or tactical circumstances. Morale, confidence, and psychological resilience matter enormously for military effectiveness, often determining outcomes more decisively than purely material factors. Equipment that provides soldiers with justified confidence in their ability to survive and succeed in combat generates tactical advantages that simple technical specifications cannot capture or adequately measure. German tank crews who faced Pershings during March, April, and early May 1945 understood intuitively what military analysts would later document through careful study, that American industrial capacity had achieved complete spectrum dominance across all aspects of military capability. The Pershing represented the final proof that no sanctuary remained where German technical superiority might compensate for American material advantages. This realization, psychologically devastating for soldiers who had sustained themselves through years of retreat by believing their equipment remained superior, accelerated the final collapse of German resistance and contributed measurably to ending the war in Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.